Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. In Celebration, Florida, Christmas decorations stayed up longer than usual, but no one noticed the silence behind one house until the smell came. Celebration wasn't the kind of place people expected headlines from. Built by the Walt Disney Company, it sold the promise of a utopian community: clean sidewalks, picket fences, and polite nods across manicured lawns. But behind one colonial-style house on Reserve Place, past the mailbox stuffed with unopened bills, something was rotting, literally. It wasn't until January 13th, 2020, that the illusion broke. Federal agents, acting on a separate investigation into healthcare fraud, arrived at the Todd residence with a warrant. What they found behind that locked door would pull the town into a national spotlight and unravel a crime so disturbing, even seasoned investigators hesitated when describing it. Phase 1. Administrative entry agents from the Department of Health and Human Services arrived just after noon. The target was a man named Anthony Todd, a physical therapist with a private clinic in Connecticut, who had been avoiding subpoenas and federal contact for months. The initial approach followed protocol. Agents knocked, rang the bell, and waited. No answer. But what they did notice was that the air around the doorway was thick with an organic stench. Foul, sweet, unmistakable. One agent reportedly paused and said, "Something's dead in there." They called Osceola County deputies. A forced entry was authorized. Phase 2. Breach and immediate discovery. Upon entering the home, deputies moved cautiously. Lights were off. The thermostat was set low. The smell grew stronger with each step inside. In the second-floor master bedroom, they found Anthony Todd. He was on a mattress, barely responsive, with an empty bottle of Benadryl nearby. Mumbled speech, labored breath. Surrounding him were the decomposing remains of his family: Megan Todd, his wife, and their 3 children: Alexander, 13, Tyler, 11, and Zoe, just 4 years old. The family dog, Breezy, lay dead nearby. No sign of forced entry, no defensive wounds, no overturned furniture, just stillness. Forensic discovery. Temporal decomposition markers. The medical examiner's team was called in immediately. Initial temperature readings and maggot development stages placed the time of death in late December 2019, at least 2 to 3 weeks before the bodies were found. Early forensic indicators. Decomposition advanced beyond post-bloat phase. Mummification patches forming on extremities. Benadryl toxicity suspected based on open packaging and proximity to bodies. There were no obvious gunshot wounds, no arterial spray, no evidence of struggle. The house wasn't a crime scene, one forensic tech said later. It was a grave. Phase 3. Containment and chain of custody. The home was secured. Items collected for immediate lab analysis included 4 smartphones found in the kitchen drawer, Anthony's laptop and Megan's tablet, pill bottles from multiple bedrooms, a notepad with fragmented, incoherent handwriting. Each item was logged and transferred under sealed evidence bags. No prints were lifted from the phones. All had been wiped clean or powered off. One deputy's body cam, later reviewed, captured the moment a responding officer whispered, "This doesn't feel like a snap. This feels like someone sat with it." Background context. Community oversight. Over the previous weeks, neighbors had assumed the family was visiting relatives for the holidays. One postal worker admitted to stacking their mail for over 2 weeks. No welfare check had been requested. When asked if anyone had noticed signs of distress, one neighbor hesitated and said, "The house was always quiet, too quiet maybe, but no one wants to be the one who calls something in if they're wrong." Federal lead-up, fraud as entry point. The only reason authorities even went to the home was due to an active federal fraud case. Anthony Todd had been under investigation for months for allegedly billing Medicaid and private insurers for sessions that never took place. He was issued multiple subpoenas and had missed court-mandated interviews. HHS agents obtained an arrest warrant and began tracking his known locations. When digital records placed him in Florida for longer than expected, despite his clinic supposedly still operating, field teams were sent. The fraud investigation, ironically, is what brought law enforcement to the crime scene. Without it, it's likely the bodies would have remained undiscovered for several more weeks. Narrative alignment. Not just a family man. By all accounts, Anthony Todd had once been considered a family man. Photos from just months prior showed him smiling at Disney World with his kids. Neighbors described him as soft-spoken and devoted to his children. But the financial reality was unraveling. His Connecticut clinic was $100,000 plus in debt. He had taken out multiple personal loans under false pretenses. Their Florida lease was nearing default. A federal case was closing in. And yet, there were no police reports of domestic abuse, no 911 history, no calls from the wife, Megan, suggesting anything was wrong. That absence of record was part of what disturbed investigators most. Final note of chapter. Silence is a layer of concealment. What the crime scene presented wasn't just a set of bodies, it was a lack of narrative. No broken windows, no defensive wounds, no sign anyone had tried to run. As one forensics coordinator later stated, most crime scenes speak. This one whispered. By the time the medical examiner's team arrived on Reserve Place, the air inside the Todd residence had reached a level of putrefaction that even seasoned forensic technicians quietly acknowledged as extreme. Despite Florida's mild winter, the thermostat had been left intentionally low, between 60 and 64 degrees Fahrenheit. The cooler interior likely slowed bacterial activity, but it didn't prevent it. The stench was thick, organic, and undeniable. The initial focus wasn't on cause of death, it was time of death. And how long 4 bodies had remained in silence, untreated, undetected, and unmoved. Each body was recovered under full forensic protocol, documented in situ, photographed from multiple angles, then bagged and transported individually to the District 9 Medical Examiner's facility. The subjects, Megan Todd, age 42, Alexander Todd, 13, Tyler Todd, 11, Zoe Todd, 4. A 5th body, a family dog named Breezy, was also recovered and logged, though standard autopsy procedures weren't initiated for the animal. Autopsy priority was placed on Megan and the eldest child due to their relatively lower decomposition stages. The team conducted vitreous fluid analysis, gastric content inspection, and entomological survey to establish the post-mortem interval. All 4 victims showed congruent time of death windows between December 18 and December 21, 2019. Insect development stages corroborated this, with larvae indicating 18 to 22 days of activity. This aligned precisely with the period federal investigators believed Anthony Todd had ceased communication with business contacts in Connecticut. What was unusual, however, was the total absence of defensive trauma. No bruising to the forearms, no skin lacerations from restraint, no indication any of the children had struggled. Each victim had trace amounts of diphenhydramine, Benadryl, in their bloodstreams. Toxicology returned with elevated levels, not fatal in isolation, but high enough to induce unconsciousness in children. This suggested a pharmacological prelude to the killings. Zoe's autopsy was especially revealing. Though her small frame had been most rapidly affected by decomposition, the cause of death was still distinguishable. Petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes and mucosal linings indicated manual strangulation. The same was found in Tyler. In Megan's case, however, the damage was different. There were 2 superficial puncture wounds to the abdomen and upper thigh, non-fatal, self-inflicted looking emplacement, but the angles didn't support that. Pathology confirmed her primary cause of death as asphyxiation, consistent with manual pressure. There was no indication of suicide by cutting. This became the first critical contradiction in the case narrative. Investigators were informed during early interviews that the wife may have been involved in some kind of pact, something about collective family harm under religious delusion, but the autopsy told a different story. None of the wounds were self-inflicted, no hesitation marks, no symmetry, no evidence of dual perpetration. Every injury pointed to a single dominant actor. Inside the house, evidence teams recovered multiple open packages of generic Benadryl. Several cups still contained unwashed residue, red stained on the interior, as if juice had been used as a mixing agent. The dining room table had a printed chart of planetary alignments and a marked-up calendar dated December 19th, circled in red ink. Forensics reviewed digital logs from the home's Nest thermostat. The settings had been adjusted on December 22nd to lower the internal temperature. That meant someone was still alive at least 48 hours after the time of death, likely longer. Law enforcement began drafting their theory. The victims had died across a multi-day period, not simultaneously. On Megan's phone, discovered in a kitchen drawer alongside the others, there were no calls, no texts, no outbound communication after December 18th. The phone had not been powered on since. One of the most disturbing discoveries came from Alexander's device. While locked and encrypted, a fragment of an audio file was recovered in temporary storage. Investigators couldn't retrieve the full clip, but what they heard was faint breathing and soft whispering, prayers in the background. There were no other voices audible, no crying, no screaming. The FBI's behavioral unit flagged the audio as significant, not for content, but for tone. It suggested anticipation, not panic, compliance, not struggle. Why the victims didn't resist remains unexplained. Back at the medical examiner's office, a forensic anthropologist noted the absence of hesitation wounds, contusions, or sharp force trauma on all victims. For a family of 4 to die in a confined home, with no sign of violence beyond strangulation and sedation, was rare. A possible explanation was emerging, but it didn't come from blood spatter or DNA. It came from the psychological profile of the household. Federal agents began requesting school attendance logs, pediatrician records, and family therapy notes. What they found painted a picture of progressive withdrawal. The children were homeschooled as of late 2019. Medical visits had stopped. Even their Disney annual passes, standard among celebration residents, hadn't been used since Thanksgiving. The Todd family, once highly visible in the community, had gone dark weeks before they died. The combination of withdrawal, financial collapse, and isolation raised a procedural flag for pre-homicide risk indicators. Retrospective forensic psychology concluded that this wasn't an impulsive crime. It was a phased disintegration of a family system. From a legal standpoint, the physical evidence built a timeline of intentional acts spaced out over days. From a human standpoint, it showed something worse, a household so silently eroded that no one outside realized it was gone until the smell leaked into the street. At a press conference held 2 weeks later, Osceola County officials were asked how this could have happened in a neighborhood so densely packed, so publicly polished. The sheriff paused, then responded, "In places like this, people assume quiet means safe, but in this case, quiet was the danger." And that assumption of normalcy behind closed doors is what allowed 4 bodies to wait too long. When Anthony Todd was transported from his home in Celebration, Florida, he was barely responsive. First responders described him as pale, dehydrated, and deeply sedated. Medical records later confirmed high levels of diphenhydramine, Benadryl, in his system. The same substance had been found in the bloodstream of his wife and children. He didn't resist care. He didn't speak until he was stabilized. When he did, the words were calm, even deliberate. "We made this decision together," he said unprompted. It was the first indication that this wasn't just a case of homicide. It might be something more complex and more disturbing. Law enforcement took that statement seriously, but they didn't rely on it. The investigation had already shifted into federal territory. In parallel with the local forensic work, agents from the FBI and Department of Health and Human Services were building a picture of Anthony Todd's professional life, particularly his role as the owner of Family Physical Therapy in Colchester, Connecticut. The findings were immediate and significant. Anthony had been under federal investigation for nearly a year before the murders. He was suspected of health insurance fraud, including billing for sessions that never occurred, backdating treatment plans, and using fraudulent provider credentials. When agents obtained search warrants for his financial records, they uncovered over $130,000 in questionable transactions. There were multiple short-term loans in his name, 2 of which had defaulted. His clinic's rent was unpaid for 3 months. Credit card statements showed minimum payments and repeated cash advances. There were no records of patient revenue beyond October 2019. At home, the situation was no better. Mortgage statements on the family's Florida rentals showed late notices. The lease had been close to cancellation. One utility provider had initiated a shutoff warning just 2 weeks before the family went silent. Anthony's emails were reviewed through his provider's cloud backups. What investigators found supported the theory of a slow, methodical unraveling. He had stopped replying to patients by mid-December. Appointment confirmations were left unacknowledged. A message from a billing software vendor flagged missing invoices, which he ignored. Meanwhile, there was no evidence that he had looked for work in Florida. No job applications. No outreach to clinics. His LinkedIn profile had not been updated since early 2018. On Anthony's personal tablet, digital forensic analysts uncovered a trail that grew darker with each week leading up to the crime. Search terms included, how much Benadryl is fatal for children? Can a whole family overdose together? And sleep forever pills. The final query was time-stamped at 2:43 a.m. on December 17, 2019. The tablet also contained notes written in a scattered, nonlinear format. Lines like, "We must go before they come," "The pain ends only when the plan is complete," and "They will understand in heaven" were saved in a file titled lightpath.toxt. There was no formal goodbye, no practical instructions, just fragments of an internal logic known only to him. In the physical world, the evidence painted a nearly identical picture. No Christmas cards had been mailed, no packages were sent or received. Their Disney passes, used regularly in prior months, showed no scans after Thanksgiving weekend. The family, once visible in the neighborhood, had vanished from view before anyone noticed they were missing. The first formal interview with Anthony Todd took place 48 hours after his hospitalization. He waived his right to counsel. During the session, he described the previous weeks as difficult but necessary. His tone remained flat. When asked about the children, he paused, then said only, "They're at peace." Detectives noted several contradictions. In one moment, he referred to the deaths as something "we discussed." In the next, he implied it was an individual decision. When pressed for details, he became vague. He said the children had been given medicine to help them sleep, but denied force. He offered no explanation for the dog's death. There was no mention of religion, but his language suggested a belief in some kind of spiritual justification. Analysts later categorized his statements as indicative of dissociative detachment, his mind separating from the consequences of his own actions. But this detachment did not come across as delusional. He answered coherently, remembered dates, and spoke with structured grammar. People who knew Anthony back in Connecticut were stunned. He had been described as gentle, kind, attentive to his patients. He coached local youth soccer, volunteered with community drives, and was known to check in on elderly clients after hours. But the image was incomplete. By mid-2019, the walls had started to close in. Audits had begun on his Medicaid billing practices. A colleague who once referred patients to him told investigators that Anthony stopped returning calls. His last scheduled clinic visit occurred in October. After that, no one saw him again in Connecticut. At the same time, his family's behaviors began to shift. Megan withdrew the children from school and informed their former teachers that they would be transitioning to homeschool permanently. Their pediatrician noted missed appointments. A neighbor in Celebration recalled that the children stopped riding their bikes around the neighborhood. One window in the front of the house had remained covered for months. None of this was reported. Behind closed doors, Anthony had isolated his family. The FBI's behavioral team identified a pattern: high control, psychological destabilization, and intentional separation from external systems. When paired with financial crisis, that combination often signaled risk for familicide, a term used when one parent kills the entire family before attempting suicide. But even within that grim framework, the Todd case was atypical. Most such cases involve violence, chaos, or some form of confrontation. This one involved sedation, stillness, patience. Investigators came to understand that Anthony Todd hadn't snapped. He had planned. Over days, possibly weeks. There was no question that a catastrophic financial collapse had taken place, but there was also no evidence of a plan to rebuild. There were no job leads, no business prospects, no documented attempts to start over. The family's relocation to Florida now appeared to be a soft disappearance, an intentional step away from accountability rather than toward recovery. In interviews with family members, it became clear that Megan had grown distant in recent months. One sibling noted she had become robotic over the phone. Another said Megan declined invitations to visit for the holidays, something she had never done before. In the end, what investigators saw in Anthony Todd was not an explosion, but a retreat. He had retreated from his work, his creditors, his colleagues, and finally his family. The crime scene was not the result of rage. It was the result of a man who believed, with increasing clarity, that there was no future left to be found. That kind of thinking doesn't begin in a moment. It builds quietly. And if no one interrupts it, sometimes it finishes just as quietly. When investigators reviewed the digital contents of the Todd family's electronics, they initially expected most of the relevant data to come from Anthony. His phone history, financial records, and internet activity had already established a clear framework of control. But what stood out during deeper forensic review wasn't just what Anthony left behind. It was what Megan didn't. Her smartphone, found powered off and tucked inside a kitchen drawer, had no outgoing calls after December 18, 2019. That date aligned with the earliest estimates of the children's time of death. Her last message was to a family member in Connecticut, a short, casual line about catching up after the holidays. It never hinted at crisis. No pleas for help, no warning signs. That silence in itself became one of the most significant details in the case. The FBI digital forensics team performed a full extraction on Megan's device. While there were no signs of tampering, they found almost nothing after mid-December. No calendar activity, no app usage, no search history. The same pattern applied to her tablet and shared family laptop. Her online presence simply stopped. Analysts called it digital cessation, the point at which a person's electronic life ends, often before their physical one does. But one folder on her iCloud backup stood out. It contained notes, short entries dated sporadically between October and early December. Some were mundane, reminders about groceries, homeschooling schedules, medication doses. Others were harder to read. A note from November 17th read, "He says we can't keep going like this. I said we're not." He didn't respond. None of the entries directly referenced abuse or threats, but the tone had changed. Early entries were structured and clear. Later ones became fragmented, more observational than expressive. "The kids don't laugh as much lately. He won't let me drive alone anymore. We don't talk about the future, only the now." These were not declarations. They were record-keeping, quiet observations from someone whose agency was slipping out of reach. Forensic analysts cross-referenced Megan's digital activity with the household's smart devices. The family Nest thermostat, accessed through Anthony's phone, showed that Megan had not used her own login since November. Their shared Amazon account had no recent orders. Netflix watch history stopped at December 12th. The digital house had gone still, even before the crime occurred. Physical evidence inside the home reinforced the digital trail. In the upstairs bedroom, Megan's purse was found unzipped but untouched. Her ID, credit cards, and checkbook were inside. On her nightstand was a copy of The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, open to a chapter on children. The page was not folded, no annotation, but investigators marked it for context. It spoke of children not belonging to parents, but to life itself. In the context of what happened later, it was chilling, not as a message, but as a timestamp. Investigators also found a stack of homeschooling printouts, lessons on geometry, biology, literature, all dated, all marked with red pen. The last lesson, on photosynthesis, was incomplete. The worksheet for Zoe, the youngest, had drawings on it. She had scribbled outside the lines. Detectives sought out any friends or relatives Megan had recently contacted. One sister mentioned a missed FaceTime call on December 14th. When she called back, no one answered. No voicemail. It was the last call attempt from Megan's number. There was no suicide note, no written explanation, but the absence of certain digital actions, no online shopping, no email communication, no calendar updates, indicated a withdrawal that was not voluntary. Megan's digital life had narrowed into a holding pattern. From an investigative standpoint, it matched behavioral data often seen in long-term emotional containment, routine without engagement, presence without autonomy. The Behavioral Analysis Unit noted that this pattern is common among individuals experiencing high-control environments. They do not always show signs of physical abuse. They vanish gradually. In choices, not in bruises. This type of psychological entrapment is rarely seen until it's too late. It's not captured in 911 calls or reports to child services. It's visible only when someone connects the patterns, what's missing instead of what's present. In a post-mortem analysis of the couple's shared devices, one final contradiction emerged. Anthony's Google activity had been almost obsessive in the days leading up to the estimated date of death. Searches about overdoses, legal consequences, and spiritual concepts of rebirth. Megan's account, by contrast, showed nothing. She hadn't been searching for help. She hadn't searched at all. That stillness wasn't negligence, it was constraint. At the federal briefing weeks later, when asked why no intervention had occurred, one official responded with quiet precision. This wasn't a family in loud crisis. It was a family in private collapse. Megan's data, her last digital footprints, were used not just to establish timeline, but to inform training materials on digital behavioral indicators of coercive control. Not every victim leaves behind a cry for help. Some leave behind silence. The challenge is knowing how to read it. Before the headlines, before the bodies, and long before the federal agents breached the door in Celebration, Florida, the warning signs had already existed. But no agency, not local police, not child services, not even the medical oversight boards, took decisive action. What happened to the Todd family didn't unfold in a vacuum. It unfolded in plain sight, behind unanswered emails, unopened complaints, and unacknowledged reports. In May 2019, the Connecticut Department of Social Services received multiple alerts regarding suspicious billing patterns tied to Anthony Todd's clinic. Anonymous reports suggested he was submitting claims for patients he hadn't seen in months. At least one former employee filed a whistleblower complaint detailing altered treatment records and patient signatures that appeared forged. That report was forwarded to the Department of Health and Human Services. It was reviewed, flagged, and placed in a backlog for routine audit. Nothing happened for 5 months. By October, federal investigators had opened a formal healthcare fraud case, but it remained administrative, focused on restitution, not risk. Surveillance began, but only around financial transactions and insurance databases. No interviews were conducted, no in-person visits were made to the Todd residence in Connecticut, and no contact was made with Megan or the children. Anthony had already relocated his family to Florida. Records showed that the children were officially withdrawn from school in early September. Megan cited homeschooling as the reason. No red flags were triggered because Florida law does not require families to register curriculum or provide justification unless under formal review. There was no such review. When the family settled in Celebration, they became invisible in a matter of weeks. There was no local pediatrician listed, no new school enrollment, no contact with neighbors beyond brief greetings. The community they moved into was designed for privacy, gated, quiet, close-knit only in aesthetic. Despite the fact that federal agents had identified Anthony as a person of interest and knew his business was shuttered in Connecticut, no cross-jurisdictional contact was initiated with Florida's Department of Children and Families. He was under federal investigation for financial crimes, and he had removed his children from all formal oversight. That connection was never made. Only in late December did the case accelerate, triggered not by child welfare concerns or psychological risk assessments, but by non-compliance with subpoenas. The fraud case reached a breaking point when Anthony failed to respond to formal inquiries for the third time. A bench warrant was issued on January 7, 2020. Field agents were deployed 6 days later. When they arrived at the Todd residence, they expected to confront financial misconduct. They didn't expect silence or decomposition. Retrospective analysis conducted by the Office of Inspector General concluded that at least 4 points of intervention were missed between June and December 2019. All were administrative. None were criminal. None were designed to address the risk of harm within a family unit. In short, there was no system in place that considered Anthony Todd dangerous until it was too late. The question wasn't whether the system failed, it was whether the system ever had the tools to intervene in the first place. In internal debriefings, one agent stated plainly, "We knew his business was collapsing. We knew he had gone dark." But that doesn't translate into a threat under existing protocol, and that's the gap between what a case looks like on paper and what it looks like in real life. Because what law enforcement saw was a billing fraud case. What no one saw was a man isolating his family in a rented home with no income, no escape plan, and a growing belief that the world outside no longer applied to him. It's easy to view stories like this in hindsight as preventable, but that assumes someone was looking. In the Todd case, no one was. Not closely enough. Not with urgency, not in time. In homicide investigations, patterns often reveal more than the confession. Behavior, sequencing, and inconsistencies in the physical timeline are dissected long before a jury ever hears the first name. In the Todd case, that scrutiny fell hard on the gap between Anthony's statements and the forensic record. Not just what he said, but how little matched the evidence. After surviving his own overdose, Anthony gave multiple statements to investigators. In each version, he altered minor details, but the core claim remained that his wife Megan had either participated in or initiated the deaths. He framed it as a joint decision, describing it as spiritual, necessary, and consensual. But the autopsy results, and more specifically the sequence of deaths, directly contradicted that narrative. Megan Todd was not the first to die. Toxicology reports showed that the children had significantly higher concentrations of diphenhydramine than Megan. Post-mortem intervals, based on decomposition and lividity analysis, placed the children's deaths between December 18th and 19. Megan's death was slightly later, estimated within a 36 to 48-hour window after her children. That distinction was critical. The timeline destroyed any notion of a simultaneous act. The evidence showed spacing, deliberation, and post-mortem manipulation. Even more telling were the subtle signs of staging. All 4 bodies were discovered in bedrooms, carefully placed in sleeping positions. Bedding had been adjusted. Nightwear had been changed. One child had been redressed entirely after death. There were no fingerprints on the clothing consistent with the children themselves, only with Anthony. This pattern of manipulation wasn't done in haste. According to crime scene reports, there was no indication of panic, no signs of forced movement, and no struggle. Every action appeared calculated to preserve an illusion that the family had passed peacefully together. But illusion doesn't hold against timeline analysis. The Nest thermostat logs obtained under warrant showed a drop in indoor temperature programmed manually on December 22nd. At that point, all the children were already dead, and likely Megan as well. But Anthony remained alive, moving through the house, managing decay. Digital forensics also confirmed that Anthony continued to access both his own and Megan's devices after their presumed times of death. He used her email account to cancel a therapy appointment. He logged into the family Netflix profile briefly on December 23rd, then never again. He didn't leave. He didn't run. He stayed inside the house with 4 decomposing bodies for nearly 3 weeks. That behavioral element wasn't just unusual, it was rare. Even among familicide cases, most perpetrators either attempt to flee, complete suicide quickly, or make contact with someone outside. Anthony did none of these. This led to another theory within the behavioral unit, that Anthony wasn't just resigned, he was trying to rewrite the end. Through actions, not words. He dressed the children, he adjusted the beds, he made them appear peaceful, as if altering the scene might change what had been done. But the forensic record could not be edited. Analysts reconstructed his movements based on device usage, temperature changes, and body conditions. Each layer pointed to a methodical process: sedation, suffocation, redressing, and then waiting. The most chilling detail came from the dog. Breezy had been killed too. Not quickly. The necropsy showed signs of poisoning and trauma inconsistent with the children's deaths. It wasn't necessary, but it was done. When asked why he had killed the dog, Anthony never gave a clear answer. There was also the matter of the lightpath.txt file found on his personal tablet. Analysts found that the file had been accessed and modified 3 times after the children were confirmed deceased. The text didn't change, but the document was opened, viewed, and closed again. No edits, just revisited. In interviews, Anthony never explained that either, but it suggested something investigators couldn't ignore. He wasn't acting from impulse. He was affirming something, returning to his own justification. In homicide investigation, lack of chaos is its own red flag. This case didn't have broken glass or overturned furniture. It had folded sheets, cleaned countertops, and a man who didn't call for help. It wasn't the violence that defined the crime. It was the absence of anything else. By the time Anthony Todd stood in court for his preliminary appearance in early 2020, the facts weren't in dispute. 4 bodies, 1 man alive, and a crime scene sealed by decay. But in American criminal justice, fact alone doesn't secure a conviction. It must be proven, coherently, methodically, legally. The prosecution's task was to present what the physical evidence already implied: premeditation, exclusive opportunity, and a lack of credible alternative explanation. The defense, meanwhile, had no confession on record that aligned with the timeline, no clear mental health diagnosis, and no third party to shift responsibility toward. At arraignment, Anthony Todd pleaded not guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of animal cruelty. No bail was granted. He was held in protective custody due to the nature of the charges. The pretrial phase focused heavily on forensic sequencing. Assistant State Attorney Danielle Pinnell led the charge, supported by FBI forensic analysts and digital investigators. They opted for a linear structure, building the case not through emotion or speculation, but through timestamps, toxicology, and evidence of deliberate post-mortem behavior. Key to their strategy was the unreliability of Anthony's shifting statements. In his hospital bed, he had implied that Megan was involved. Later, during interviews at the county jail, he claimed he had come home to find them already dead. He described a moment of panic, suggesting he tried to overdose out of grief. But when investigators pointed out that he remained in the home for nearly 3 weeks afterward, canceling appointments, turning down the thermostat, and moving the bodies, he offered no clear response. He simply said, "I wasn't ready to leave." That inconsistency formed the foundation of the prosecution's timeline. According to the medical examiner, the children had been killed between December 18th and 19th. Megan died 24 to 48 hours later. Breezy, the dog, appeared to have been poisoned after that. Nest device logs placed a manual thermostat adjustment on December 22nd. Netflix activity occurred on December 23rd. This meant one thing: the defendant had not only remained in the home, but maintained it, not as a man in shock, but as a man actively concealing a crime. Court filings emphasized the deliberate nature of the deaths. The presence of children's sleepwear, cleaned and changed, beds made, devices powered off, medication administered prior to asphyxiation. There was no element of unpredictability, no trauma-based injury, no blunt force, only sedation and suffocation. That level of control, argued the state, ruled out impulse. This was not the result of a single moment. It was the end of a process that had started months before. Financial collapse, social withdrawal, ideological shift, and isolation. The decision wasn't made on one night. It was made in stages. The defense pushed for psychiatric evaluation. A private forensic psychologist was brought in. His findings were inconclusive. Anthony showed traits consistent with depressive disorder and delusional ideation, but did not meet the threshold for legal insanity under Florida statute. He was oriented to date, understood the charges, and demonstrated structured logic during evaluation. The prosecution declined to pursue the death penalty, citing cooperation during arrest and lack of prior criminal history. But they made clear this was not a case that required guesswork. It required alignment, and the forensic timeline aligned without gaps. There was also the matter of Megan's journal entries. The state submitted excerpts from her digital notes and cloud-synced files as part of the pretrial record. While not accusatory, they painted a picture of a woman growing increasingly detached from autonomy. "He won't let me go out alone. I'm scared but don't know what to do." Phrases like these didn't prove motive, but they helped frame Megan not as a co-conspirator, but as a silent casualty of psychological coercion. The state's case was built on 3 unshakable pillars. Anthony was the only adult alive during the time of death. His timeline conflicted with all physical indicators. The victims were sedated, staged, and left unreported. In courtroom settings, emotion can obscure fact. But this trial avoided spectacle. There were no outbursts, no media frenzy inside the chamber. Just a quiet, thorough progression through data, pathology, and procedure. It was a slow case to try, but it was airtight. The jury would need only to decide whether silence, maintained, prolonged, and uninterrupted, was louder than any defense could speak. On April 14, 2022, inside a courtroom in Osceola County, Florida, Anthony Todd stood silent as the judge delivered the sentence. There were no outbursts, no tears. The man once seen as a family doctor, a devoted husband, a father of three, now faced 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. An additional year was added for the killing of the family dog, Breezy. He showed no visible reaction. The courtroom had been packed. Reporters lined the back wall. Family members of Megan, Zoe, Tyler, and Alex sat stiffly in the gallery. Prosecutors did not dramatize the evidence. They didn't need to. The facts were already overwhelming. The autopsy results had been irrefutable. Each child was found to have toxic levels of Benadryl in their system, far beyond any accidental dosage. The deaths weren't instant. They were sedated, then suffocated. Megan Todd, the children's mother, had been stabbed. Forensic evidence confirmed Anthony's DNA on the knife. No defensive wounds suggested surprise or incapacitation. The suggestion that Megan had been the perpetrator, as Anthony had once claimed, collapsed under even minimal scrutiny. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Digital forensics had added further weight. Anthony's online activity included searches for how to make someone sleep permanently and Benadryl overdose in children. His phone data showed no 911 calls, no attempt to save his family, just a pattern of avoidance. Financial records revealed a looming disaster: debt from a failed private practice in Connecticut, mounting loan defaults, and fraudulent Medicare billing investigations underway. Agents from the Department of Health and Human Services had been closing in on him before the murders. But no one expected what would unfold in Celebration, Florida. The aftermath revealed something darker than stress or financial ruin. It exposed the fragility of image. Todd maintained a facade to friends and neighbors. Polite, calm, often described as too quiet to be dangerous. Behind closed doors, he isolated his wife, minimized contact with extended family, and shielded his children from outsiders. The prosecution did not argue mental illness. He was evaluated and deemed competent to stand trial. There was no psychotic break. The court concluded he acted deliberately and with full awareness. No mitigating circumstances were found. Despite the defense's attempt to shift blame, citing alleged mental deterioration and overwhelming stress, the judge remained clear. You made a choice, not once, but 4 times. Each life you ended was a decision, and you showed no remorse. Anthony Todd was escorted out of the courtroom without resistance. He did not glance back at the gallery. In the broader public sphere, the case sparked questions about visibility and intervention. Why hadn't warning signs been caught earlier? Megan's family had tried contacting authorities when they couldn't reach her in December 2019. Neighbors had sensed something was wrong but dismissed their concerns. Even federal investigators failed to apprehend Todd weeks earlier due to bureaucratic delays. By the time local police entered the home in January 2020, it was too late. The home was a tomb. The bodies had been there for days. The smell was undeniable. The scene was described in testimony as one of the most disturbing in modern Florida homicide investigations. Yet the case did not trigger national legislative reform. No new protective laws were passed. No systemic overhaul of wellness checks or child protection protocols followed. That silence speaks volumes. From an investigative standpoint, the Todd case was airtight, built on forensic data, digital evidence, physical documentation, and timeline consistency. But it also illustrated a recurring theme in family annihilation cases. The killer rarely erupts suddenly. The collapse is incremental, hidden, and often ignored. Megan and the children were not failed by one person. They were failed by multiple points of contact that looked the other way. A culture of privacy, pride, and appearances kept their suffering behind closed doors. It is easy to vilify a man like Anthony Todd, and rightfully so. But the harder question remains, how many families are in quiet crisis, unnoticed, because they don't look like a threat? This case is not about a monstrous anomaly. It is about the consequences of unchecked control, of isolating behaviors dismissed as stress, and of a system that still waits for a tragedy before acting. In true crime, viewers often look for the turning point, the one moment that could have changed the outcome. But in the Todd case, there wasn't just one. There were many, each ignored, postponed, or downplayed. And in the end, the price was irreversible. What happened to Megan, Alec, Tyler, and Zoe is something no family should ever have to endure. As someone who's walked through the darkest corners of this case, I'm left with a truth that feels hard, but necessary. Silence protects no one. If you sense something is wrong, speak up. If someone withdraws, check in. In this world, appearances can be deceptive, and real danger often hides behind a well-practiced smile. In sharing this story, I don't just want you to remember the tragedy. I hope it pushes all of us to be more aware, more compassionate, and more courageous. Do you think this case could have been prevented if someone had acted sooner? What signs would make you speak up? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story moved you, let me know where you're watching from. If it didn't resonate, tell me why. I want to hear your honest take. If you found this video meaningful, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps bring more true crime stories with depth, truth, and impact to light.